Emir's Education in the Proper Use of Magical Powers by Jane Roberts, illustrated by Lynn Cherry, read by Martin John. Chapter 5. Emir in Troubled Waters and in a Clash with Troublemaker. Emir sat in his boat and waited for a wind to lift his sails, but no wind blew. He said to himself, "I'll be polite and just wait, no matter what happens. I've learned that much anyhow." The blue ocean water glistened, and white foamy waves lifted his boat gently up and down. The sun shone, and the air was so soft it tickled. But still no wind blew, and Emir got hot and restless, and hotter and more restless. He didn't ask the wind to blow, though. He told himself that he was through asking for favors, or answers, or help, or anything at all. He'd just go where the wind blew him, if there was a wind. On the other hand, he was feeling very wishy-washy. It looked as if he could sit there forever if he didn't do something. So, forgetting his resolutions, he thought that maybe he'd make one simple request just to see what might happen. In a small voice, he whispered, "I'd sure like some wind to lift the sails of my boat." And just then he remembered the oars, which he'd forgotten entirely while he was waiting for the wind. So he started rowing and rowing. His arms got tired. Finally he became very, very angry, and without thinking he shouted out, "I demand some wind." At once the wind began to blow, and his little boat picked up speed, and more speed. For a minute Emir was worried, but then he thought, who would hurt a little boy? No one. Even the God of all life hadn't hurt him. So when you came right down to it, he could really demand all he wanted. Not that he would, except when it was necessary, like right now when he wanted to get home. Still, he thought, the wind was very brisk indeed. Worse, it suddenly changed direction and was carrying his boat as fast as it would go, backwards. Backwards! There was no doubt about it at all. Now that he stopped to think about it, Emir supposed that Skymaker had probably faced the boat in the right direction. And if he had, well, now it was going in the opposite way. "You stop that!" Emir shouted. "I demand that you stop this minute." The wind stopped. So did the boat. "That's not what I meant," Emir cried. "You might just as well go in circles." And promptly the boat just did that. "No, no!" Emir shouted again. The boat stopped, and Emir realized that he'd forgotten the direction his boat was facing when he started out, and now he didn't know which way to go at all. Emir thought and thought. If he didn't demand the right thing, he'd never get any place. It occurred to him that there were tricks you had to learn once you really started demanding. Yet it was very confusing because if you didn't demand at all, you didn't get any place either. Night was coming. Emir spent so much time worrying that the sky was dark before he knew it, and for the first time he was really afraid at night. He couldn't see at all. There was no moon, and there was no stars, just the sound of water, and it sounded as angry as Emir felt. "All right," Emir shouted. "I demand some lightning so that I can see where I am." But lightning just doesn't come alone, of course. And a gigantic storm suddenly burst upon Emir's part of the ocean, The waves roared and leaped higher and higher, and the water was like a massive ocean animal, trying to shake Emir off its back. The little boat rose and fell. It shot up almost mountain high, and then back again. And Emir gulped mouthfuls of water until he choked and coughed. The lightning cut across the sky's angry dark face like a sneer, and terrified fish stared wide open when they were tossed up by the waves. Once a whale rose right up next to Emir's face, and the whale was furious. Emir was sure it yelled, "It's all your fault," before it dived back again into the sea. Who'd unleashed all that fury? Emir didn't even have time to wonder about it. His umbrella was useless in all the wind, and he was so mad at the storm that he yelled, "I hate you, you nasty old storm," and shook his fist, which made him lose his footing. He fell down in the boat and gobbled more water, and in the next flash of lightning he saw his honey-filled coconut shells go overboard. Nothing was working right. "I'd like to know who's responsible for all this," he shouted, and suddenly, in front of his boat, a terrible and mysterious creature began to rise. It was made of solid water, with ocean spray all over it like white, foaming liquid fur, and it was 50 feet high, or so it seemed to Emir. Towering above him, as he watched, it waded toward him, smashing the waves with its giant arms, and its white foamy beard blew in the howling wind. It put out one glistening water-solid finger and stopped Emir's boat right where it was. Emir threw his hands up in alarm and shouted, "Why me?" Then he cried out in a trembling voice, "Who or what are you?" The towering, howling creature looked like a tornado, only with a face that kept changing position, so that sometimes its eyes were on a level with Emir's, boring into his, it seemed, and sometimes they were high in the air, burning like the windows of a skyscraper on fire, though skyscrapers hadn't been invented yet either. The thundering voice roared, "I'm Troublemaker, and I'm very angry, as you'll soon discover." "Oh, I believe you," Emir answered quickly, "though I didn't know there was anything like a troublemaker." "There's one now," Troublemaker said, and as he spoke he sent up walls and walls of water in huge waves that seemed to come from nowhere just to threaten Emir's boat. At the same time the sky poured rain, black rain, and each raindrop cold and sharp. In terror Emir put up his umbrella, knowing that the wind would probably rip it away. "A lot of good that will do you," Troublemaker roared. "You want to go home, do you? You'll go with a vengeance." And as Troublemaker said that, a new tornado-like burst of wind picked Emir's boat right up in the air and whisked it higher and higher. Emir looked down. He saw the ocean and his coconut shells bobbing up and down in the water. Then he was so high that he couldn't see anything below clearly at all. The black wind made a sound like a train in a tunnel, and like a jet plane taking off, and like the siren of a police car or ambulance all at once, even though none of those things had been invented. Troublemakers seemed to know how to make their sounds anyway. Then, even worse, Troublemaker himself suddenly took the shape of the darkest tornado and whistled and moaned and turned inside out and tied himself in knots, all the while carrying Emir and his little boat high in the sky, looking as small as toys. Emir hardly could hear himself think, not that he was thinking too well anyhow. His teeth chattered. He clamped one hand over his earring to keep it from falling off, and Troublemaker carried him and his little craft higher and higher. He had no idea how long this state of affairs lasted, but suddenly Emir realized that Troublemaker was muttering, and that all those awful sounds were Troublemaker's grumbles, and Troublemaker was saying, "You're the troublemaker, not me. You're always stamping your feet and demanding something or another. Want to go home, huh? Well, this is a trip you won't forget." Emir almost forgot how scared he was. He was so angry and outraged. "What do you mean?" he shouted. "I'm not a troublemaker. I'm not the one who's causing all this wind and blackness and these terrible noises and—" But Troublemaker interrupted. "It's not bad enough that you stopped the rain once and made all the alligators sick." "How did you know about that?" Emir gasped. "Or demand answers instead of listening to the message from the God of all life," Troublemaker shouted, raging with swirling winds. Emir tried to interrupt, but Troublemaker went on. "It wasn't enough that your ship was all freshly painted and filled with provisions and pointed in the right direction." This seemed to make Troublemaker even angrier than before, so angry that he threw up his windy arms in dismay, letting Emir and his boat fall out of his grasp. This time Emir really shouted as hard as he could because this was the most frightening thing that had happened so far. "No, you are never satisfied," Troublemaker continued, never missing a word as he swept down below Emir and grabbed him and the boat up again. Emir was so grateful at being saved that he cried, "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you." "Did you actually say thank you?" Troublemaker asked, making somewhat less frightening noises. "I certainly did," Emir replied. "Well, maybe you're not so bad after all," Troublemaker said, in a still gentler way, and Emir noticed that the wind wasn't as loud or the sky as black. "You don't seem quite as angry," Emir said hopefully. "That's because you aren't as angry," Troublemaker answered. And now Emir saw that the clouds he was in were changing color from black to gray to billowing white. He and his ship were now sailing along inside the fullest white cloud, and sunlight was beginning to show around its edges. Troublemaker said, "Your anger and your demands just got so big that you couldn't hold them inside you any more. So they formed me. I was your grumbling, troublesome self. Besides, the ocean and the wind got tired of you trying to boss them around all the time. So you got what you asked for." "I just don't understand," Emir said. "I try so hard." At the same time he looked out to see that he and his cloud were coming closer and closer to Earth. Troublemaker said, "You try too hard. That's part of your trouble. You could have just used your oars longer than you did. A wind was coming up to fill your sails anyhow, but it was busy someplace else at the time. But you couldn't wait." Troublemaker was now very gentle, but strong, fluffy cloud, with only a slightly worried air, and he sat Emir and his boat down very easily at the mouth of the river that led to the swamp that led to Emir's father's kingdom. "Remember, now, you can't go bossing nature around," Troublemaker said. "Nature always works for you when you let it." "I promise I'll never do it again," Emir said, and this time he really meant it. But Troublemaker had turned into a very tiny cloud, and then into a filmy mist, and finally he disappeared altogether. Emir just sat there catching his breath. Then a lovely wind rose behind him and pushed his boat briskly through the swamps toward home. But Emir began to frown as he wondered how to tell his father that he'd failed his mission. Would his father be very angry, or just terribly disappointed? And how would the problems of the kingdom ever be solved now? Emir shook his head and tried not to think of it at all. End chapter 5. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.